Final Fantasy VII review from IGN. Let's see. That was loud.
Standing on the edge of Midgar's expressway at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake, the seemingly infinite possibilities of what could come next left me overwhelmed with a yearning I hadn't really felt from a game before. So in several ways, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is my
I know he said yearning. It sounded like he said yearning, which I find funny.
wildest imagination made
This is the high quality commentary you can expect from Luke Stevens Live. Cheers.
manifest. Its impeccable combat is made fresh again with clever new mechanics and party members, and splitting the original's overworld into gorgeous open regions full of enjoyable side content enriches places I thought I knew so well. That lets this reimagining once again stand as both a stunning reconstruction of a game I've cherished since 1997, as well as an interesting new interpretation of it. However, Rebirth's continuing ambition to create a new timeline for Final Fantasy VII can bounce between awe-inspiring and overly convoluted. That's left me conflicted about parts of the execution of that new direction, but after spending more than 80 hours to finish the main story and a decent chunk of side content, there's no denying that Rebirth is an amazing journey despite that, and one I'll remember fondly as I eagerly anticipate the third act of this rebuild of Final Fantasy VII.
Very good. Fill your hollow heart with rage.
I would love to know what the player breakdown is like. Like what percentage of players that are buying this are familiar with Final Fantasy VII already, and how many of them are new? Because I genuinely don't know. I don't actually know what the breakdown would be like. Most people I've come across, like in chat, who are really excited for this, know the original game. Maybe they weren't, like, they didn't play it at launch back in 97. Maybe they have played it recently, or like, I think there's a mobile port where you can play it on your phone. So maybe they've played it those ways. But I wonder what the mass market appeal of this game is. Like, how many people that have never touched Final Fantasy 7 are going to try it, you know? I did play it at launch. Thanks for making me feel old. Sorry, Leo. Sorry. I was born in 1997. How's that? How's that? Do you feel old yet? Did I break your brain yet? Yeah. I tried Final Fantasy VII Remake and it wasn't for me. I know a lot of people that like tried it and got like halfway through it and then just stopped playing for one reason or another. When did Final Fantasy VII Remake come out? Was that maybe 2019? 2019 maybe? 2020 you guys are saying? It was 2020? 2020 is such a blur for me, dude. It's such a blur. I'm like, man, 2020. When I think 2020, I'm like Ghost of Tsushima and like not God of War, The Last of Us Part 2. I think Marvel's Avengers came out that year. But that whole year is such a blur. Well, Warzone also blew up during that time, so I think that was the big game that year. But yeah.
As soon as I stepped foot onto the grasslands, the first of 6 regions that make up Rebirth, I was stunned by its impressive scale. The cutscene introducing the reformed overworld shows Aerith taking in the beauty of a natural world she'd never seen before, only to have Red 13 remind us that this world is still dying from the inside.
But in reality, it's barely hanging on.
Reinforcing the
It's beautiful, right? And it's about to go to poopy. We need to work together. What are the odds that they combine these games into one big one? I did that with critiques. You guys know, like, one of my most popular videos ever was the Batman Arkham series critique, which is like 3-something hours long. And it's basically just, I took the critiques of Asylum City, Origins, and Night, stitched them together, cut out the intros and outros of each, and just made it one big video. On my end, I think it was, if I recall correctly, it was like I was bored on a Friday. I had off from work, and I was like, I should just do that, even if it only does like 20,000 views. At least it's more than like 20,000 more than I had. And so I stitched it together in an afternoon. It was like super low effort on my part, ended up being my most popular video. It just goes to show you, if you don't work hard and you lazily throw stuff together when you're bored, your dreams can come true. It's great. But I wonder if they're going to do something similar here, if they're going to come along and like stitch Remake, Rebirth, and then whatever the next one is together into one gigantic 15-disc PlayStation 6 game that's 300 hours long. Why not, right?
Going theme of environmental preservation, and that this is a planet worth fighting for. There's something powerful in exploring each corner of these regions
love the foliage
just to see how
density.
they've clung onto life in spite of the destructive effect of Mako energy, and there are stories to be told in the breathtaking views alone.
And there it was, the first step on our new journey.
Of course, a game this massive also comes with a somewhat intimidating world map that has embraced many modern open-world design conventions. That includes activating towers to mark tasks on your map, but Rebirth manages to transcend that well-worn trope. As I went from region to region, connecting with people and helping with their struggles, I often found compelling little side stories that uplift its human element. The more I peeled back the layers of all the activities that fill these zones, the more engrossed I got in clearing every icon I could.
Sephiroth was in Midgard. We fought him. Whatever happened, he's alive.
But why come back now?
Nearly every task rewards you with XP for your party level to advance an additional progression system called Folios, which unlocks perks and abilities for each.
See what I mean though about the IGN footage capture? I don't know what potato they're recording their gameplay on, but man, this is maxed out quality, and it looks like they just took a handful of Vaseline and Nutella and sprinkled it and smudged it all over the screen. Like, I don't, obviously it's a 1080p video, but still, this seems like really, really low bitrate for that. This has been true of their Dragon's Dogma coverage. They've had really, really crappy footage. It's true of their reviews recently. There's something going on with IGN where the quality of their footage is just crap. I don't know what it is. It bugs me, man. Bugs me. Like, Elgato just announced like the greatest capture card on the market. It's like $230, HDMI 2.1. It can do like 4K 144 hertz. It's outrageous. It is outrageous. It's like $230. They could use that for this. Buy an external hard drive, record onto that thing. You'll be good. You'll be good. Why am I some random YouTuber? Why do I invest thousands into like a server and a dedicated capture device and a Ninja 5 Atomos for capturing full quality footage in HDR? Like, why am I going to these lengths and IGN of all groups isn't? It's crazy. It's crazy.
Character. The biggest additions are synergy abilities, powerful partner attacks that lay on heavy damage and can grant bonuses like extending stagger windows, filling the limit break bar, or temporarily negating all MP costs. You'll also access synergy skills that can be used on the fly to make combat more flexible. A favorite of mine was having Barrett launch Tifa into the air to get her within melee range of flying enemies. Synergies complement an already intricate combat system by filling gaps in the action, making the combat loop more complete, and having party members work in tandem is always charming to see. The returning pressure and stagger systems once again push you towards understanding combat on a deeper level, since stronger enemies won't go down through simple button mashing. Having the tactical foresight to orchestrate an offensive push that exploits an enemy's specific vulnerabilities and the skill necessary to execute it all is so rewarding, and the pressure of aggressive, unforgiving opponents really makes you work for those satisfying moments.
Thanks so much for everything.
While the returning cast all fight just as they did in Remake, new enemies and mechanics encourage you to bring out more in your party members. Yuffie can be an absolute menace now, with a party around her and a full game to build out her skill set, standing out as the most dynamic character of the bunch. The finally playable Red 13 can turn defense into offense with his Vengeance stance and fast combos, and destructive abilities like Stardust Ray can make short work of enemies. Constantly switching between characters and setting them up to play their parts offers both a constant variety in the moment-to-moment action and the satisfaction of playing the field general. However, at times there was a little dissonance between how your party functions and what the enemy is capable of doing. Certain foes zip around the battlefield at such high speeds that even the targeting system has trouble keeping up, and getting constantly knocked back or caught in multi-hit combos is an occasional annoyance. Thankfully, these brief moments of frustration never overshadow the soaring heights Rebirth's combat reaches. With enough practice, preparation, and wits, even the hardest battles are a thrill to conquer. Unironically, some of the best battles are actually in the new card game, Queen's Blood. It's an outstanding addition that had me sinking hours into it. Not only is it smartly designed, there's an entire side story that builds up around it as you progress.
I love me a good in-game card game. Maybe that's just like me being weird. I don't know, man. I love me a good in-game card game. Gwent is awesome. I have like behind me the Orlog collector's thing that they sent me. It's a full Orlog set with like stone pieces. It's outrageous. I love me some Gwent, some Orlog. Oh man, oh baby. And this is, it looks like their version of it.
Exploring the origins of Queen's Blood itself and going in some wild and unpredictable directions you won't want to miss. While the larger story Rebirth tells is a heart-wrenching and compelling one, it does take a while for it to initially come into focus. After opening with the hard-hitting flashback of the tragedy at Nibelheim, Cloud and Tifa's hometown, you'll spend a lot of time getting acquainted with the flow of the open regions and their many diversions, in between a handful of critical plot points. By front-loading a lot of those diversions and minigames, it can lose the thread of what Cloud and the gang were even supposed to be doing in the first place. Don't get me wrong, many of these activities are a joy in their own right, and a few of them make for memorable moments of levity, but a little restraint could have helped keep the focus on the parts I cared about most. For as cool as the Junon marching minigame and the Queen's Blood matches are, there's also the occasional slow-paced crate-moving puzzle or a stealth section to unlock a region's chocobo to bog down the momentum. That said, these are ultimately small blemishes on what is largely a fantastic revision of Final Fantasy VII. And if anything, the more robust minigames capture just how goofy the PS1 classic always was, and leading into that absurdism works wonders for staying true to its identity. Rebirth manages to strike a delicate tonal balance as well, which is impressive for a story full of darkness and sorrow. The planet's very existence is at risk, with Shinra's destructive nature and Sephiroth's calamitous ambitions looming.
The smoke rising from the rubble is reminiscent of a funeral pyre.
Cloud himself is a broken man, an unreliable narrator, and a complicated protagonist, and in the highest fidelity of modern tech, his slight but telling mannerisms speak as loud as anything he said in the original script. Nearly every party member has their moment to shine in this arc of Final Fantasy VII, and through impeccable cinematic stylings and top-tier voice performances, the cast teetering between hope and despair is on full display.
Sorry we're late!
For the love of... Where the hell have you two been?
On a date.
Baird's backstory was already unforgettable, but there's a newfound authenticity to the struggles he faces and painful resolutions that await him. Those modern qualities, along with the reimagined script, give additional depth to Red 13 and round him out as a more complete character too. Aerith becomes an emotional leader, and the relationship between her and Tifa grows stronger and more believable as they confide in each other and bear the brunt of Cloud's baggage.
So, did something happen between you and Tifa?
So much.
Rebirth is often cheesy in its writing and revels in its melodrama, but that's part of its charm. Inside the cloying displays of friendship and the theatrical pleas to protect the planet are undeniably genuine messages about how we carry ourselves in our own lives. That tone lets this particular brand of storytelling strike a chord as effectively as it does, elevating Rebirth above many of its contemporaries.
We're taking off!
What? Rebuilding Final Fantasy VII's story for a new generation has also come along with the theme of defying your supposed fate, which was made explicit toward the end of Remake with the convergence of alternate timelines affecting each other. But while this new take on the classic story has the potential to be equally as powerful, it pains me to say that Rebirth fumbles the execution. Avoiding any spoilers, the events of its conclusion and the ensuing aftermath are portrayed in a way that is both convoluted and undefined, robbing it of its impact. It's a case of trying to do too much without the connective tissue to bring it all together. Cryptic messages and nuanced meanings can be well and good, but sometimes stories have to speak plainly about what is actually happening, and Rebirth does not when it needs to most. But even with the messy delivery of its conclusion, some of the new scenes surrounding that finale do offer sobering messages about grief, letting go, and the acceptance of life's eventual end. These quiet moments encourage a different kind of reflection that the original wasn't able to touch on. How we make sense of our lives and our place in a world full of tragedy is a complicated and messy endeavor that seems full of contradictions, and Rebirth makes that fittingly clear. So even though the new path these remakes are trying to forge is both fascinating and flawed, Final Fantasy VII's story once again manages to hold a poignant mirror up to our own world 27 years later.
The life stream.
27.
It is the very essence of our star. The blood coursing through its planetary veins.
Final Fantasy VII Rebirth impressively builds off of what remakes set in motion as both a best-in-class action RPG full of exciting challenge and depth, and as an awe-inspiring recreation of a world that has meant so much to so many for so long. After 82 hours to finish the main story and complete a decent chunk of side quests and optional activities, there's still so much to be done, making this pivotal section of the original feel absolutely massive. Minigames, side quests, and other enticing diversions fill the spaces of its vast and sprawling regions, painting a new and more vivid picture of these familiar locations. But more than just being filled with things to do, Rebirth is often a powerful representation of Final Fantasy VII's most memorable qualities. It does fumble the execution of its ending, getting caught up in the mess of its multiple twisting timelines, but new moments and the overarching journey manage to evoke a deeper sense of reflection in spite of that. So for as flawed as parts of how this classic has been reimagined might be, Rebirth still stands out as something both thrilling and unexpectedly impactful.
Still alive?
Miraculously, yeah.
I mean, shocker, it looks really good. So there's that. Yeah, and I mean, they dropped the reviews a week ahead of launch, which is always a sign of real confidence and polish. That's great to see. Rebirth on PS5. So Digital Foundry, they looked at it, and I mean, you can see their side-by-sides. Their footage is going to be way better.
Final Fantasy VII is perhaps the most well-known JRPG of all time.
Look at that.
It pushed technical boundaries on the PS1 and set new standards for storytelling within gaming. Its long-anticipated remake trilogy, starting with 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake, is similarly ambitious, seeking to flesh out and rework the RPG on modern hardware. And in about a week, we're getting the middle part of the trilogy, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which promises a much larger and more sophisticated entry exclusively on PS5 console hardware. So today we'll be taking a first look at the final game on the PS5 and try to settle a few key questions. How have graphical boundaries been pushed on PS5? Have the demo's image quality issues been resolved?
Yeah, so performance mode pre-patch. When I first was trying the demo, performance mode was rough. It was rough. So it seems like they've at least addressed it.
And can the game hold a stable frame rate, even with its open world scope?
Already, their footage is so much better. It's not even
This
funny.
video is more of a preview
How
than
much
the
sharper
typical
everything is.
in-depth
Jesus.
coverage we'd like to deliver. Because of an unusually strict review embargo, we can only show you content from the first few hours of the game. We have to avoid certain sequences, and we're only allowed to produce a short video. Plus, the game's image quality has been in a state of flux pre-release, with a major patch arriving shortly before this video's publication. So we're going to split our Rebirth coverage into two videos. This preview video and a more in-depth piece covering the embargoed content in the final game to arrive on the game's release day. Let's start with the opening cinematic, which shows the decimated Midgar after the events of Final Fantasy.
There are some studios or some publishers that are really, really restrictive with their embargoes and stuff, where they say, like, you're only allowed to show these missions. You cannot show anything from after this mission. One game I remember reviewing, they said, like, we weren't allowed to show any part of a cutscene after a certain line of dialogue was spoken. And through like another line of dialogue spoken. So it was like super specific, and it wasn't even like particularly spoilery. It was just weird that they had that very specific requirement. It was just, some studios are very, very controlling when it comes to embargoes and stuff. I don't know why. A lot of the time, like, it's one thing if you're trying to avoid spoilers for something like The Last of Us Part 2. Hey, don't show those spoilers, please, in your review. Other companies, it's always really weird. It's like, don't show them talking about this city because this city might be a spoiler for a future game that we don't want people to know about before the game comes out. It's just weirdly restrictive.
The opening cinematic, which shows a decimated Midgar after the events of Final Fantasy VII Remake. There's some very nice rendering on display here, but it did take me a few moments to realize this wasn't a real-time sequence, which is probably a credit to advances in real-time rendering. After a brief gameplay
For me, it's the smoke effects. The smoke effects look too good to be real time. Like, come on. Consoles are powerful nowadays, but they're not that powerful. That's way too realistic.
To realize this wasn't a real-time sequence, which is probably a credit to advances in real-time rendering. After a brief gameplay interlude, we're back in Unreal Engine 4 driven real-time rendering with the flashback sequence from the demo that was released a couple weeks ago. A few things stand out here right away. Firstly, the asset quality is very inconsistent in this area. There's plenty of good-looking rock formations with decent levels of texture detail, but it's easy to spot some oddly low-resolution work here. Some of the rocks are also very angular and low poly. This whole climbing sequence looks inconsistent and a bit strange, and not quite up to the level of quality we'd expect from a modern big-budget game. To Square Enix's credit, there's lots of ground clutter and these scenes do exhibit a good amount of density, but the overall fidelity just isn't quite where it should be.
It is weird that it's so inconsistent, because in some cases you have rocks that look pretty good next to weird porridge dried on a paper towel. Like, it's really weird. Really high quality, low quality. So it's like they forgot to go back in and replace the placeholder assets or something. It's just weird.
Environmental lighting is also a bit hit or miss. In shadowed regions, we don't see very effective light occlusion, which gives certain scenes an overly flat look. You end up with an impression that certain areas are glowing, or that some objects are floating, without the kind of lighting accuracy many current-gen games strive for. Both of these issues, the asset quality and lighting problems, were present in 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it's disappointing to see that improvements haven't been made, at least in the Mount Nebel area. The shadow resolution in this area is pretty conservative, which gives the shadows an aliased quality, though the filtering helps somewhat here. But at very close range, we get a high-resolution cascade, which produces distracting pop-in as the camera nears shadow detail. It's a very strange choice, but there are some very important visual strengths here as well. The real-time cutscenes look beautiful, as they did in Remake. The characters are lavishly rendered, with excellent skin shading, detailed, smoothly animated card-based hair, and pitch-perfect clothing materials. These scenes are always lit very evocatively and feature creamy bokeh depth of field. The cinematic direction here is just on another level from what we see in most other games too, and resembles the heights of Square's CGI work in other titles. Battle sequences are impressive as well. Fights are a confluence of acrobatics and particle effects, punctuated by show-stopping special abilities and breathtaking synergy attacks. The combat mechanics are fairly basic, but provide just enough tactical depth to justify the pyrotechnics on display. After the Mount Nebel flashback, which comprises Chapter 1, we're on to the open-world abundance of Chapter 2. The city area here, Calm, actually looks quite impressive relative to the environmental work we've seen thus far. Assets are generally acceptably high-res, without the texture inconsistencies we observed before.
Except those bottles. Those things look stupid. Right behind my face. Look at those. They're like 3 triangles each. Oh, baby. I mean, again, if you play this game and your takeaway is like, the game's great, but the bottles are low poly. It's like, you're never going to like it. It's not a big deal.
High res, without the texture inconsistencies we observed before. There are still some slightly questionable textures in the mix sometimes, but the overall asset quality is reasonably high, and scenes are dense with detail and pedestrians. Lighting quality sees a bump too, with finer grades of pre-calculated shade in shadowed regions. Again, it's nothing revelatory, and I did manage to spot a bit of light leak here and there, but the city is quite nicely lit overall. On the whole, it's a huge upgrade from Nibelheim, which looked almost generationally worse. And then when we step out into the open world for the first time, which is introduced with an absolutely stunning real-time cutscene with striking shots of the principal cast and pans of the coastal landscape, the game starts to look much more impressive. The level of environmental density is clearly a step beyond most last generation efforts, with abundant, lush greenery and impressive geometric detail. Those errant textures that gave off a poor first impression are mostly absent here, and the landscape looks consistently good. The lighting still isn't perfect.
It makes
Note,
me
for
wonder
instance,
if like
the
they really prioritized these areas for polish because they were like, hey, this is where a lot of the review footage is going to come from. This is where a lot of people are going to spend their time really nitpicking and stuff. But like, it is still so surprising to see something from the beginning of the game with a lack of polish. Because in my experience, especially during review periods, it's the early game stuff that gets polished like crazy. Because they're like, okay, people are going to pay a lot of attention to the first 5 hours of the game. Later stuff we can work on when we get there. But, you know, we'll focus on the early game. So it's just surprising to see later in the game is more polished than early.
low-lying grass and weeds don't seem to occlude sunlight at all, giving them an overly flat look. Shadow resolution is also pretty middling in general, with a higher res shadow cascade at very close distance. But the prior environment...
It's weird that it renders the shadows in a higher resolution when the player character approaches that spot instead of when the camera gets closer. You know? It doesn't really make sense that as Cloud gets closer, the resolution of the shadow gets higher, but as he moves away, it drops. I don't really understand why they would do it that way. That's just a little weird. All I can think of is imagine this game running on like a 4090. Just imagine this game with each of these pieces of vegetation casting shadows and stuff. Oh man.
But the prior environmental woes we saw before aren't nearly as much of a problem.
Maybe it is the camera, but why did it take... It's still like that right there. You see these shadows get way sharper when the camera gets close to the tree.
Through chapter 2, and the game generally looks very nice.
It's
Based
just a
on
weird
its first
choice.
2 chapters, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a good-looking game, albeit one with certain characteristic visual flaws that do emerge in some scenarios. It's definitely a step beyond its predecessor, but it isn't making a lot of use of current-gen exclusive rendering tech. Rebirth ships with 2 visual modes, a performance mode which targets 60 FPS and a graphics mode which targets 30. In terms of basic settings, these 2 modes are essentially identical, with little to separate them beyond resolution metrics. But there's something curious going on with the performance mode, which has just changed in the last day. People who have played the demo might be familiar with the problem here. The performance mode in the demo code looked overly blurry to many players, which actually remained an issue with the initial code that we were provided. It looked very soft, certainly softer than the resolution, which often hovered around 1152p or so would suggest. As of the February 21st patch, this issue has been addressed, though with mixed results. The game's bicubic or bilinear upscale to 4K has been replaced with something that looks reminiscent of a nearest neighbor technique. You get extra image sharpness, but you also get visible pixelation all across the image. So image quality comparisons between the 2 modes are a little more interesting than usual. The graphics mode has extra image detail and none of the distracting pixelation present in the performance mode.
That's
The
really
graphics
weird.
mode can look 4K-like on some details, while at other times it looks more like 1440p, though the actual internal resolution is usually at or near 4K. Perhaps this is a sign of lower resolution post-processing getting in the way a bit, which would help explain why the performance mode was so blurry before. Frame rates are good across both modes at least. The graphics mode presented a near perfect 30 FPS across the content I tested, with no variation outside of a very occasional dropped frame. Open world traversal and combat generally sailed by at a straight 30. The game still looked a bit choppy though, as there's no camera motion blur applied to the image. I think Rebirth would look a lot smoother with a healthy bit of per pixel blur on camera movement. The performance mode operates at 60 FPS the vast majority of the time, which is a solid achievement for an open world Unreal Engine 4 title. But the game does have a tendency to drop frames from time to time, with the most prolonged dips occurring during intense fight sequences and when traversing in Nibelheim. Sprinting around Calm, you see the occasional dropped frame or 2, and open world traversal at speed sometimes induces a dropped frame. Most of the time it's right at 60 however. Rebirth is mostly in good shape here, though I do wish the image quality issues in performance mode had been addressed in a different manner. Solving whatever bugbear is causing a softer than expected image should be top of mind here, as the scaling solution Square Enix has gone with is unsatisfactory in my opinion.
It is interesting. Like, I'm still shocked that we're this far into the generation and it still feels like we're getting incremental improvements, but I don't know. It feels like a lot of developers are building off of the performance mode. They're like trying to hit the 60 frame because people throw fits over that. And I mean, honestly, if you look online, most gamers tend to throw more of a fit about the game not supporting a full like performance mode 60 frames than they throw a fit about the quality mode not being quality enough. You know, it's just surprising that we're this far into the gen, over halfway through. And it really doesn't feel like we've seen many games take full advantage of the hardware, you know? Like performance mode, he said, I think was 1152p. It's wild. Like normally you see only a couple of games that are really pushing the graphical boundary in the first couple of years of the generation. And then as the generation goes on, everybody really takes it up a notch and you get some stunning games. But, you know, here we're just, it's surprising. It's surprising. I mean, the game still looks freaking phenomenal. The demo, I'm glad to see they fixed this. Or at least addressed it in a way that looks better, because it was weirdly blurry before, and at least now it seems sharper. So yeah, I mean, it looks gorgeous. The performance mode is iffy. I might go through it on quality mode, honestly. Just like if you don't get used to 60, it's a lot easier to play it at 30. But if you go from 60 to 30, it feels real bad, man. But if you start the game at 30 and you just go through the whole thing at 30, it's doable. I think one of the things that exacerbates this, though, is a lot of people have upgraded their TVs in the last 5 years. So I think a lot of people, if you've moved from like a 40-inch TV and you're now playing on like a 55 or 65-inch, or even upwards of like 75, 85-inch, which are now hitting consumer houses relatively frequently. If you're playing on a big screen, I mean, playing on a performance mode that's rendering at 1152p is like, you can tell. You can tell, because like the reason these TVs are so big is because at 4K you still retain the sharpness even as it scales up. But if you go to low resolution and you stretch the image that much, even if it's upscaling to 4K, it's still very, very blurry on a big screen. Which is why like the promise of these consoles was that you were going to be able to crank the resolution and the frame rates, but instead it seems like games are still basically rendering it close to 1080p, and then they just upscale to 4K. And sometimes it works better than others, but most of the time it's like, it's not quite doing it. He took my thing.